I'm truly honoured to have been asked to speak tonight by the Rule of Law organisation, having regard to the people who founded it, the beliefs that they held in order to create an organisation like this, which is unique in this country, and the trouble and effort and time that they've spent to propagate this important idea. I'm glad that in this country we take for granted a lot of things, such as the rule of law, because it means it's well established. It's not a life or death matter. And one of the negative consequences of that is that although, as I'll try to show during the things I say, pretty much everybody in this country assumes its existence, believes in it, and expects others to believe in it. Most people don't know the detail of it, or even that it has a name, the concept has a name. So I honour you for what you've done, and I regard it as a very, very important thing that you've asked me to speak tonight. And as to you, Margaret, you've left me speechless, so I'll speak to you later. I'd like to recount two small episodes in my life that illustrate a point that I want to make. The first of these was something that happened in Russia when I went back there, the only time I've been there. My father had left, as Margaret had said, fled the country in 1930 and never went back. He was too frightened to go back for fear he wouldn't be allowed to leave again. I thought that was fanciful. It might not have been fanciful, but in any event, that's the effect it had on him. So I went back after his death and met his brother and met my mother's relatives. And I had gone there to visit friends who'd come to Australia, and I'd met them here. They lived in what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. And so they one day took us to a park in St. Petersburg. It was summer, and it was a beautiful park with old trees, and everything was the kind of green that you never see in Queensland, or in New South Wales for that matter, that kind of rich, summery Northern Hemisphere green. The grass was beautiful, and my wife was with me, and I took her hand and I led her onto the grass, and I did a pretend slow motion, skipping, and sang some love song. And my Russian friends immediately stopped us and dragged us off the grass back onto the path. And they said, "You can't go on the grass." So you look, and there's no sign. I said, "There's no sign." She said, "No, you can't go on the grass." I said, "But in Australia, there'd be a sign." And she said, No, there'd be a sign saying you can't go on the grass. He said, "Here, there'd be a sign that you can go on the grass." The second incident was something that happened in 2014, 2015. The Newman government in Queensland wanted to appoint a particular person to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And it seemed to me that the government was under the mistaken impression that a Chief Justice is rather like a Chief Executive Officer of a company and can set policy for the production of what you produce in the corporation and can direct subordinates to do the necessary things to achieve, to execute that policy, to achieve the product that you want at the end. And it seemed to me that they had found a person that they thought would faithfully do that for them. And nobody was objecting to it, and I just couldn't stomach this, so I objected publicly to the proposed appointment and appeared on a current affairs show to say why I objected to it. And at that time, we had a carpenter who was coming to our house every day to replace the pool deck at our house. And every morning I'd give him the cup of tea that I had to give him before he worked. And he said to me, "I seen you on TV." And I said, yeah. And he said, "It's the separation of powers, isn't it?" Now, I never referred to the separation of powers in anything that I'd said publicly, and I'd never mentioned it to him. And the Australian Constitution does not contain those words. So it's interesting that he sensed the same thing I sensed, although he couldn't have understood the concept, but he could put a name to it. I'll come back to those two little events a little later. I take it that because you're here, you have some notion, probably a good notion, as to what's comprehended by the rule of law. So I won't waste your time by telling you what it is, but let me just summarize the 3 or 4 main points that arise in it so that you understand me and to be speaking about this and that we understand each other. The essential elements of the rule of law are that, first, the laws that are going to govern us are fixed and stated in advance so that you can see what it is that you have to do and what you must not do before you engage in action. And they ought to be publicized as well so that you can inform yourself. Secondly, those laws that are made apply to everybody equally unless a differential operation can be rationally justified. That is to say, you can't discriminate between people in the application of laws on arbitrary grounds. Thirdly, the members of the executive government are also subject to the law, and the actions of the executive government must be authorized by law. We do not have government by the use of powers that are completely discretionary and that are untrammeled. There is no such thing as an unfettered discretion. And the laws otherwise apply to members of the government doing their work and the servants of the government. And the fourth thing is that in order to achieve the equal application of the laws and only the application of the laws before somebody is condemned or rendered liable civilly, the dispute must be determined by an independent and impartial arbiter, a judge who is independent of the legislature and of the executive and has no interest in seeing the outcome of policy and has no other interest in the outcome of the case. So they're the essential doctrines. And of course, they have ramifications because if you have to have an impartial judiciary, then for reasons I won't go into, but I'm sure you're familiar with, you need to have the separation of powers. Otherwise, you can't have an independent, impartial judiciary. Similarly, in order to... anyway, that's enough on that. Now, the concept itself is ancient. We can see instances of its operation as far back as 4,000 or 5,000 BC in the civilizations in Mesopotamia. As recently as the 4th century before the Common Era, Aristotle was writing about it. He said, it is more proper that the law should govern than any of its citizens, and that people holding power should be appointed only guardians and servants of the law. When government is not in the laws, then there is no free state for the law to be supreme in all things. England, more recently, and France and Germany, and other states, not all of them, in Europe, had its peculiar history which led to the modern conception of the rule of law and the form of government that we have, and we inherited that. That is all extremely interesting. I find it fascinating, but I'm not going to waste your time tonight speaking about matters of that kind. Some of you will have a sense of it, some of you will have a very deep sense of it, and in any event, you can find it out very easily. What I was curious about was why this idea should have arisen at all in human existence. Why did Aristotle and Hammurabi, why did the English activists during the Glorious Revolution, why did Sir Edward Coke get into conflict with James II? Why do we have a rule of law society here? Why does this idea arise? Where does it come from? Could it be that it is, in some fashion, a part of human nature? We speak of human nature very loosely, but could it be that this is something that is a part of being human? What I would ask you to do is with me, to consider the question as if we were Martians who were examining life on Earth as it is now, and examining not just how humans behave, but how lots of animals behave, and coming from the planet Mars, where, let us assume, life is completely different, and there aren't organisms like us who are just complete and an unimaginable form of life. So they come here and everything is new, and they immediately see that every single individual looks unique. Apart from identical twins, there are no two people who look the same. And you can have a blonde, curly-haired, blue-eyed man from Germany who doesn't look at all like a brown-haired, straight-haired, brown-eyed man from Germany also. And this difference is expanded when you come to groups, because the group of people in Vietnam do not look like anything like the group of people from Ethiopia or Denmark. And having seen that everybody's different, and there are large groups of different looking people in combination who look similar, within it they're all different, but they look completely different from another group, you then study more, these Martians study more, and they see that in some important respects, despite these differences, all humans are absolutely identical. We've got one head and two arms and two legs and so on, male and female, with all the differences that connotes. Each of them is a member of the species Homo sapiens. Now, it's not possible, as it is with a species of genus and species of fish, to divide Homo sapiens into subspecies. You can, but it's Homo sapiens sapiens, for reasons I won't go into. So every instance of a human being on the planet is Homo sapiens, and in some respects they are identical. If we look at the genetic basis of humans, which I'll come to in a minute, you'll see that it descends to the level of our genetic makeup. If we compare, let's see if this works. Our DNA, or anybody's DNA for that matter, I'll come back to that. If we look at the DNA of every human, as we'll see in a moment, the similarity is overwhelmingly great. But if we compare our DNA to the DNA of chimpanzees, the species Pan-troglodytes. Now, we did not evolve from chimpanzees. Chimpanzees and Homo sapiens evolved by two different paths from the same ancestor. If you compare the DNA of humans, we have 46 DNA molecules per cell. Chimpanzees have 48. That's a huge difference in this context. And there are other big differences between humans and chimpanzees. So when we look at humans, it's common in our day and age to speak of race. Race is a taxonomic term, a term that defines groups. It's an informal subdivision of humans into groups. It's a social construct used to categorize groups of people according to differences that are apparent. There may be cultural differences, you know, West Germans from East Germans. There may be phenotypes. The expression phenotype is used to describe the differences that genes create. So I have a beautiful nose. Chris has a nose. And we obviously have genes that create noses in the womb and genes that create how the noses are going to grow as children and into adulthood. And his genes produce that phenotype and mine produce this phenotype. That's what it means. A phenotype is a physical characteristic produced by genes like blue eyes, brown eyes, big noses, etc. We have used the concept of race to ascribe value to groups of people. As you'll see a little later, when my parents came here to Australia, one of the ticks on the form was race that you had to fill in. So we come back to DNA, and upon examining it, as we now know the human genome having been defined, the level of DNA in every person is 99.9% identical. That leaves 0.1% that's not the same. If we look at that 1%, 95.7% of that 1% represents differences in people that we regard as of the same race, including color. That is to say, the genes that determine color of skin are the same in everybody. So it should come as no surprise then when you look at that, the molecular level of the makeup of humans and what they're like physically. It should come as no surprise that despite huge cultural and environmental differences bearing upon us as we live our lives and the lives of our ancestors for centuries, I'm speaking about the last 500 or 1,000 years, that we engage in, excuse me, there's the chimp that we're not like. It should come as no surprise that our behaviors are also largely identical in important respects. A man called E.O. Wilson, who was an expert in ants, wrote this book, which was published, I think, in 1972. And he was a biologist, obviously. And the thesis that he put into that book was that human beings, wherever they're found, from the depths of the Amazon, some people who've never met a Caucasian or anybody from a city, and a person from New York or Sydney will do things that they both do, and a lot of them. And what he proposed back then, before, I'm not sure now whether Crick had discovered the DNA helix or not, but in any event, long before the knowledge that we now have of DNA, Wilson proposed that there was in the structure of human beings a commonality that explains behaviors that we have in common, despite groups of people never having had any kind of intercourse with each other, social or sexual or any other kind, so that we have in common the use of language, which Noam Chomsky has demonstrated arises from the structure of the brain. That is to say, we are wired to speak language, and so we're wired with a grammar that whatever the idiosyncratic sounds might be that you make, they follow similar grammatical patterns. That is, that there are patterns, and you might put an adjective behind the noun or in front of the noun, but you're using an adjective and a noun together, whether you're an Eskimo or a Greek or an Australian. We laugh, we make jokes, we lie. Males and females are regarded as having different natures. We engage in baby talk with our young children before they're old enough to talk. We have gods. We decorate our bodies with drawings and with jewelry. We murder each other. We create norms that prohibit murder. We use tools. We exchange things. We have expressions that describe kin relationships. We use numbers. Might be primitive, but they're still numbers. We cook. Sex is generally done in private. We have names. We dance. We play. We have music. We have sexual taboos. In particular, child incest is taboo pretty much everywhere. In fact, everywhere except where it's aberrant. And importantly, we have, wherever we come from, distinctions between right and wrong, big differences about what's regarded as right and wrong, but we have the sense of right and wrong. We have a sense of empathy, unless you're a psychopath, and I think only 5% of people are psychopaths. We have a notion of reciprocity. I expect you to do for me what I do for you. And we have concepts of fairness. Concepts of fairness is very interesting because as soon as your child has learned to speak, they're liable to complain to you that it's not fair. You know this, and you did it yourself. And that's despite never having been taught about fairness. There does come a point where you teach the lesson. You've got to share your toy with your brother, and this is your brother's toy, and it's not right for you to take it away from him, and if you take it away, you've got to let him play with your toy. You do that. But before you're taught any of that, a child is liable to complain that some order that you impose upon behavior is not fair. Not only that, but we are so much the same that in different places and at different times, groups of us have independently invented agriculture, writing, pottery, embalming, astronomy, coinage, rituals to do with events in life, such as marriage, rituals to do with gods. So as Martians, we would notice the distinct dissimilarity of human beings, and the most crucial thing is how much they are the same, not only in their physical features, despite what really are minor differences in physical features, big noses, small noses, color of skin, size of lips, type of hair. The essence of what's important in life seems to be common wherever you look, over whatever period of time since Homo sapiens existed, and as we'll see in a minute, maybe before that. And we would notice this, that we can add to the list that you've seen and the list of practices such as agriculture. As Martians, we would observe that a lot of animals, not just human beings, but a lot of animals function together as groups. Some don't, but a lot of them do. So fish are very primitive in terms of animals. There are more primitive, they're vertebrates at least, but they're very primitive vertebrates. And yet they function as a group. They live, if you like, in a primitive community, or at least coalesce for periods of time in a community. And they school together, they have to cooperate with each other. And we can infer that a fish swimming as part of a large group like the one that you see gains an advantage, because if you're in the middle, you're less likely to be eaten. That's why injured fish get eaten. I used to, like a lot of people who earn too much money too soon, I bought a fishing boat and went marlin fishing. And the way one of the ways you catch marlin is to find a bait school like that. You drop some tiny little hooks into the middle of it and jiggle them, and these fish then seize on the little hooks, and you can pull up 3, 4, or even a dozen at a time. You catch them and you keep them alive. You have a live bait tank that's aerated, and you catch about 20 of them, that'll do. And then you go back to the bait school, because the marlin, if they're going to be there, are going to be circling to attack these fish. And you put a large hook through the nose of your little sardine, and it's still alive, and you throw it back into the group. Now it's an injured straggler, and will attract the predator marlin. So they're conspicuous, and if you're in a group, you're inconspicuous, so you see a degree of primitive cooperation by these. And that also pertains to more advanced vertebrates. It's the straggler antelope that gets caught, classically. So you have a degree of cooperation to that extent. But when you look at our close relatives, reasonably close relatives, the chimpanzee, we will observe as Martians that not only do they live in groups, but they do things with each other that are cooperative. These two are grooming each other, and they're grooming each other to find lice and to kill the lice, and they expect each other to cooperate each way so that each of us finds the lice on the other and destroys them, and that reduces the degree of lice in the group, and that's good for everybody. And it doesn't take a lot of language or thinking to come up with that notion that chimpanzees have somehow come up with. But moreover, the males go out hunting and come back with meat. These are vegetarian chimps, but the meat eaters go out hunting and come back with meat. And not all of them hunt, but they all share the meat. And what biologists have found who've studied this is that if I share my meat with you today, and you don't share your meat with me tomorrow, you can just go whistle for meat next time I've got to kill, which is very interesting, so that we see not only a level of cooperation, but an appreciation that it must be reciprocal. So if we go back to here, in the second last line, we have the word reciprocity, which humans, in which humans engage, and even chimps do. They actively cooperate with each other, live in groups and actively cooperate with each other. So humans are, as I said, Homo sapiens. Our immediate predecessor was Homo erectus. Homo erectus was on the Earth for 2 or 3 million years. We've been around for about 300 years, 300,000 years, so we've barely scratched the surface of experience. So they were here for that period, and scientists have found footprints of Homo erectus that are more than 1.5 million years old, and which evidence the passage of a group of about 20 of these people, and the foot size shown in the fossilized remains, or the footprint remains in stone that was once mud, imply that they were males. So the inference is that Homo erectus engaged in community behavior. Homo sapiens emerged. Our brain is larger, and most importantly, we have the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that deals with intellectual thinking, cognition, and therefore when the Martians look at us, they see the same kind of behavior but at a much more sophisticated behavioral level. So, all right, that's all very good, and that raises a large point for us. Community living requires cooperation. You can get cooperation in a variety of ways. One of the ways you can get cooperation is through violence. And so in some old civilizations and in some modern modern communities, that's the way you get the cooperation. If you don't cooperate, I'll kill you. Or maybe I'll kill your family, and then I'll kill you. And pretty quickly you get the level of cooperation you need. But you can also get cooperation by persuasion. We have language and the power of reasoning, and so we can obtain cooperation by persuasion. But why did animals of any kind, fish, why did fish evolve to cooperate? It's useful, but why did they do it? Can I digress for a little bit to talk about genes? Because I did the DNA thing, and I have to tell people about it now because I feel an urge to unburden myself of all that knowledge. We're made of atoms, of course. Atoms are arranged into units we call cells. The cells are the smallest unit of structure of smallest organic unit of construction of animals. We used to think, at least I was taught this when I was at school, that there's a nucleus, it's surrounded by stuff we call plasma or something, and then there's a membrane and that's it. But in fact, they're very complex, and they contain what in the human body would be called organs. In the cell are called organelles because they're little. And among the organelles are 46 DNA molecules. Each of these 46 molecules is unique. That is to say, in you, there are 46 molecules. Each one is different from the other. But every DNA molecule, every set of 46 in your body, in every cell, is identical. Every set is identical, although every individual of the 46 is different. And every individual molecule in another human being are different from each other and different from yours. And the set that they have are still 46, but they're entirely different from yours. The whole unique set is repeated in every single cell of your body, except those that just don't contain DNA because they don't contain a nucleus, like a red blood cell. But it doesn't matter. They're minor exceptions. These DNA molecules work consistently to operate, to do things in your body. A skin cell is a cell with a nucleus and a membrane and the plasma and the DNA molecules. And the cell in your retina is a cell with a nucleus, the DNA, and the membrane. Their structure is completely different and they do different things, but the DNA in each of them is identical. And it's these individual cells then containing the DNA that join together to make skin, tendons, muscles, organs, and bodily fluids. You're made of this stuff. One of the DNA pairs determines sex, and we can put that to one side, and the rest are interesting because they are made up of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and hydrogen, just that, in different combinations and in different quantities. Each of them makes up sets of molecules, and it's those sets of molecules that make up DNA. There are only 4 molecules in various mixtures that make up the DNA cell. If you took a single molecule of DNA, those are chromosomes. A chromosome is a molecule of DNA that's been tightly wound up. It has to be tightly wound up because each DNA molecule is about 2 meters long if you stretched it out. If we took every DNA molecule in your body, each of these 46, laid them out to their 2 meters length, and every one of them was laid out end to end, it would stretch from the sun to Pluto, which is, you can't even think about that. So for that reason, they're tightly wound into little packages as though they were tightly wound in Glad wrap, and they can be seen under, you can't see a DNA molecule because the DNA molecule, its width is smaller than the wavelength of light, so it's invisible. But when it's tightly wound like that, you can see it. So there they are. You're a collection of atoms, and leaving aside environmental factors, to which we'll return, how you are prone to behave is as much a result of this physical combination of molecules as how you look, and the size of your heart and the size of your liver, your ability to run, the ability to do anything that you do. Let's assume anyway, for the purposes of tonight, that human traits, behavioral traits, are the result of the work done by genes within a person. So let us take it also as true that the primary function of genes is to continue the replication of genes. It's the genes that matter. You can put it this way, it has been put this way. The chicken is not the point. The chicken is just the egg's way of creating another egg. Because the thing to do is to create another egg that will replicate the genes in due course with another chicken. But the chicken is just the vehicle for the genes. So each human trait, behavioral trait, like a beautiful smile, or the ability to run fast, or the propensity to be easily irritated, or to be placid or not irritated, arises as a result of a gene, and that gene must have arisen at some point as a mutation. They must emerge as new genes, and then they must survive. Now, the survival of genes depends upon three things. First, the person who carries it has to survive long enough. Secondly, the person carrying it has to reproduce. And thirdly, the relatives of that person or that person's offspring has to survive to reproduce. And the probability of any of those things happening can be calculated together, at least notionally, and we call that genetic fitness. So the more likely you are to survive, to reproduce, and to see that your offspring or your close relatives survive, the more fit your genes are to effect that purpose, and you have genetic fitness. Genes that promote genetic unfitness are not going to survive, either because you don't survive, or you don't reproduce, or your offspring or your close kin don't survive. So the genes that promote survival means that the individuals survive. That's what natural selection means. Some animals do not only have the genetic tendency to live in symbiotic relationships like the fish that we saw and human beings generally. Some animals also have a predisposition to advance the group interest at a cost to themselves. Some species perform acts that can be described as altruistically directed for the good of the group. There was a scientist, an anthropologist called Jane Goodall, who did a lot of work with chimpanzees, and she observed that chimpanzees that are orphaned will be cared for by their chimpanzee uncles and aunts. You know, we take it for granted that if your child is orphaned, your sister or your brother will take them in. Somebody will take them in. We take that for granted, but consider chimpanzees doing this, and you ask, why do they do these altruistic things? Some kinds of animals will do altruistic acts, although it will kill them. Ants, certain ants, you know, some bees, when they sting you, it rips out their guts and they die when they sting you, and some wasps. They kill a threat to the colony by a suicidal attack. They're insect suicide bombers. They're insect kamikaze pilots. One example of it is the chromosomes, which you can actually see under a microscope. One example of a suicidal defender of the colony is Globotermis sulphureus. This is a soldier termite, as I think all of you would know to some extent. In an ant colony, in a bee's hive, there are animals that are bred for particular purposes. So the drone bee and the worker bee and ants are the same. These are soldier ants that are born and bred in order to defend the ant colony. And this particular suicide bomber has a huge pair of glands which extend from their heads. And when they attack an enemy, a glandular secretion comes out of their mouths. It congeals in the air, and entangles the enemy ant in this goo, and the excretion of this goo is powered by abdominal contractions that are so violent that sometimes the abdomen and the glands explode and spray the fluid in all directions. Now, that is interesting, because you can call it the equivalent of a soldier diving on a grenade to save his mates in the platoon. The consequence of that is that the soldiers' fertile siblings will survive, and the colony's gene pool will also survive, although the soldier doesn't survive. In the middle of the last century, the 20th century, biologists began to notice that rather than there being individual selection of genes, so that I go out and I do my best to ensure that my genes will prevail, so I do the things necessary to ensure that, and I'll elbow you out of the way in order to get that. There was something that they described as group selection, in which the group is the thing that is meant to survive, not the individual. The probability of survival of individual living things or of populations increases with the degree to which they harmoniously adjust themselves to each other and to their environment. That principle is a basic precept of nature and is responsible for the balance of nature. It orders the subject matter of ecology and of evolution, and it underlies scientific understanding of how organisms behave and how they develop, and it's the foundation of sociology. One can view then the community of animals, whether it's the fish or the ant colony, as a superorganism, as a single organism, where, by analogy with the cell, the units that make up the structure are the individual ants. A single organism made up of multiple animals. Well, an amoeba is an animal. It's the simplest organism, a single-celled organism that exists independently. And so our bodies are made up of multiple little amoebas of different kinds because of the effect of DNA. And so in that sense, we are a superorganism of little organisms. The cells that make up your skin, when you're wounded, some of the cells die and fall off and other cells replace them in a cooperative group manner. Now, there are many forms of life in which the central concern of the animals is the group. Within let me just go back a moment. I said a moment ago that the work in the middle of the 20th century suggested that there might be a change in how one looks at natural selection, from individual selection to group selection. And Dr. Wilson, who wrote On Human Nature, was a believer, as most people were, in individual selection. And then this article was published in 2007, and the lead author is David Sloan Wilson, no relation to Edward Wilson. And he was doing work which he said demonstrated the efficacy of group selection, and he ended up persuading Edward Wilson of it, and together they wrote that article which changed everything in the field of science in which they were working. And indeed, they quoted in that article this statement: the probability of survival of individual living things or of populations increases with the degree with which they harmoniously adjust themselves to each other and to their environment. This principle is basic to the concept of the balance of nature orders the subject matter of ecology and evolution, underlies organismic and developmental biology, and is the foundation of all sociology. So what they concluded is that the science that they called sociobiology required them to study the behavior of animals, not so much as individuals, but within a group. And what they found was this: traits that are called altruistic or cooperative are disadvantageous as a matter of natural selection when regarded from the point of view of an individual. So if you find yourself in a group, say a firm of solicitors, you're more likely to get ahead if you're selfish and brutal and just serve yourself. But the group won't survive. The firm will fail in the end. And if everybody's like that, the firm will fail all the more quickly. In a group where everybody or most of them are altruistic and cooperative, they will be more successful as a group than the selfish group. Now that must be right, and you see it, don't you? That's why a platoon of soldiers is trained to cooperate with each other. It's why you have team meetings and team retreats and all the rest of it, because you know that as a group you will compete more efficiently against other groups if you cooperate. In summary, what the two Wilsons found was that selfishness beats altruism within single groups. Altruistic groups beat selfish groups. In all animals, not just humans. Humans are the most successful animals on the planet, and we can consider some of the traits that make us so successful. At the simplest level, we can point things out to each other. That's a big thing. You learn something, you don't have to learn it yourself, I'll point it out to you. There's a predator over there. Language, which allows us to communicate with each other at a very detailed level. Our ability to imagine something because of our prefrontal cortex, something that doesn't exist, and communicate that as a symbol to somebody else. Our propensity to trust is very interesting because we are prone to trust, which is why we're so shocked when somebody cheats us. And the fact that we do trust means that we can get on with the business of cooperating without doing an analysis of a person's character every time. You can just assume that they're going to be doing their best and they're not going to cheat you. Our extremely advanced ability to form an intention and to communicate that intention and to agree to make it a common intention, and our ability to imagine abstract things, to create a symbol about it, and then to communicate that abstract notion to somebody else, which aids us then to form a common purpose, which itself is abstract, and then to create an intention, which is another abstract, and then to begin cooperatively to move towards achieving that aim. None of those things are needed for selfish acts. So a shark does not do any of those things, but it doesn't need any of that. It just needs to feed and reproduce, and it can get by on its own doing all of that. Every now and then they'll get together and eat the same thing, but you don't speak of sharks cooperating to hunt down their prey. They just happen to be there because they've all smelt blood at the same times. Now, could I then illustrate the human issue of selfishness and altruism in a practical way? Some of you will have heard of what's called the prisoner's dilemma. You have two subjects, and each of us has a choice. I can inform, I can remain silent. If I choose to inform, cooperate with the authorities, and you choose to inform and cooperate with the authorities, we're both executed. If I choose to inform and you choose to remain silent out of loyalty to me, you're executed, I survive. If we both remain silent, we both survive. There's the problem. I don't know what you're going to do. We can talk about it, but you might lie to me about what you're going to do. So I just don't know what you're going to do. And I'm frightened because if I do the wrong thing, I'm going to die. And what's worse, you might live in that case, and that's even worse, that I would die and you would live. Better that both of us die. Maybe not, maybe not. Maybe I should cooperate. Anyway, I don't know what to do. So, from the selfish point of view, it's a dilemma which is actually insoluble in a single instance. But if you look at it from the genetic point of view, and that can happen, we are each members of the French resistance in World War II. You're my wife. We're both arrested, and they separate us into different cells, and they say, inform or remain silent. Well, I don't know what she's doing in there. But what I know is that we've got children, so I will remain silent. And then whatever she does, she lives. So if you change the paradigm, if you change the framing from individual success to group success in terms of the group surviving and maintaining, there is no dilemma. The group survival approach is to regard the survival of a remnant of the group as primary. On this footing, you know what to do. Many people have done this, and we call it heroism in general. So we turn then to the nature of altruistic acts, and we see, upon examination, that there are two kinds of altruistic acts. The first is the truly noble, heroic thing, like the termite soldier, or the soldier falling on the grenade to protect the team. There's no reciprocal benefit for the actor. You just do it, and still we do this. They're rare enough, those acts. But nevertheless, we've evolved so that on some occasions, like the soldier, the termite, we do this to aid the group. The second kind of altruistic act is one which you perform with it's a good thing in the sense that you're doing something for somebody else. In that sense, I'm not speaking about good and bad here. It's a thing that you do for somebody, which aids them in some respect, like the lice, but you expect them to reciprocate. And if they cease doing it, then you'll stop doing it. And there's game theory, which you can examine in order to work out what the best way it is to behave in order to achieve the best for yourself in terms of getting cooperation from each other. The chimpanzees, as I've said, go hunting and will share the food, but by God, you'd better reciprocate, otherwise the sharing will end. We see that at the very superficial level, I think, when that's two chimps who didn't share. They're getting into an argument. This is road rage. And when somebody doesn't let you in, you get upset. And sometimes you follow that other car and try to get in a position where you can cut him off and not let him in as well. Now, that's the product of a lack of cooperation, which provokes a reaction in you. So when you let somebody in, that's an act of altruism, and you expect reciprocity the next time you're out. Compared to other animals, Homo sapiens have reached a very sophisticated level of conceptual thought. We are born with a propensity to think about things and to learn things so deeply that they also affect the way that we behave. So we come from the genes themselves, which provoke our acts in very powerful ways, to the environmental factors. And there are many ways in which you learn things to do which aren't genetic. You've heard about positive reinforcement and Pavlov's dogs, and you get an electric shock if you do this, and you get a pellet of food if you do that, so you can be taught by that means. That's you would think, a very rare form of learning. There is a form of learning that psychologists call prepared learning, for which you're prepared. You're made so that you're prone to learn this. These are things like becoming frightened of heights, or becoming frightened of poisonous animals and spiders, and becoming attracted to particular things that are good for your body. But we're also genetically prepared to learn a language, for example. And then in 1961, at the height of a belief in behaviorism, some of you might recall B.F. Skinner, who believed that everything that we did could be programmed into us by stimuli, positive and negative reinforcement, and put his infant daughter into a Perspex box so that he could feed her the right amount and, you know, make sure that she'd got this and got that on a scientific basis. At the height of the belief in those sorts of systems, a Stanford psychologist called Albert Bandura conducted an experiment in which he made a film of an adult with one of those inflatable dolls, like usually a clown with a weight on the bottom so that if you knock it over, it comes back up, called a Bobo doll. And he filmed the adult bashing the hell out of the doll and kicking it and hitting it with things. And then he had a group of children, and some of them were shown a film of the adult behaving in this way with the doll, and some were shown no film, and some were shown a film of the adults playing gently with the doll. Notice there's no positive reinforcement, no negative reinforcement. It's not something you're born to learn. And Bandura found that the children who watched the model behavior of the adult beating up the doll, a majority of children in that group behaved like that you see, which was startling at the time because nobody knew, or at least scientists didn't apprehend that there was a form of learning just by looking and then behaving in the same way. So ideas about the altruism inherent in genes must confront not only the fact that not everybody has those genes, because some people have nasty little genes and they don't want to cooperate with anybody, but also there's the influence of environment, including the influence of other animals in the environment. So we arrive at this conclusion: cooperative societies do better than ones in which dog eat dog. The most complicated social structures that exist, ours, are made from very high levels of cooperation, involving adherence to detailed principles and rules. And these principles and rules must take account of the fact that an instinct for altruism is not universally manifested. It's largely it largely exists. It largely is manifested, but not always, otherwise you wouldn't need laws. All of us, I think, have a sense that it's better to get along by getting along with people and living in that fashion than under the laws of the jungle. Working out how to do that is a more complicated thing, and it's conceptual, it's cognitive, and it's conceptual. The idea of a cooperative society may be instinctive, and it may be reinforced by culture, or it may be hampered by culture, but it's still just a seed, and the conceptual scaffolding that allows the erection of a stable constitutional democracy, for example, is quite another thing. John Maynard Keynes, the great English economist, wrote his textbook, The General Theory of Employment, Money and Interest. And he said he was addressing his book largely to economists. And he was, towards the end of the book, he wrote that, you know, all of this might be very, very complicated, but you've got to do it anyway. You've got to do this complicated economics anyway, because nothing arises without that kind of work. What he said was the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they're wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Let me just pause there. Most people don't read John Maynard Keynes. Most people who were for Marxism or were against Marxism never read anything Marx wrote because it's tedious and hard work. So the notion that ideas of this sophisticated kind have an effect is not self-evident, because most of us don't read about these things. Some of us do and dip into it, but we're not scholars of ideas by any means. So what Keynes was saying was counterintuitive. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else than ideas of economists and political philosophers. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. I'm sure that the power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared with the general encroachment of ideas. Sooner or later, it is ideas and not vested interests which are dangerous for good and evil. The ideas that we're speaking about are the ideas that are inherent in the rule of law. And we can have a basic notion, as it appears people always have done, and people before people, I mean Homo erectus, and non-people, now chimpanzees, have a notion of cooperation as the better thing for the continued success of the group as a group. But it's another thing having this prefrontal cortex that thinks too much. It's another thing to devise a sophisticated set of principles that can be understood at a gross level, as my carpenter did, but can also be analysed and justified at the deeper, complicated level, as lawyers sometimes have to do and as thinkers in other fields sometimes have to do. We, in this country, are the blessed inheritors of a history that, despite the violence that is in it, has meant that each of us in this country, at least each of us here tonight, otherwise we wouldn't be here, takes the virtue of the rule of law for granted. As I said earlier, I think that's a good thing, because we have our fixed ideas about political matters, and including ideas and ideology. We have fixed ideas about whether this government is good or bad or ought to be replaced, but none of it is life and death for us. You know, some would say there's not much difference. And so we can't afford to take it for granted, and that's a good thing, because it's a sign that we live in a stable constitutional democracy. So much was it taken for granted that even in the late 1800s, the lawyers who drafted our Constitution didn't see any need to refer to any of these things. No separation of powers, no Bill of Rights, no mention of responsible government, no mention of free speech, no mention of the independence of judges, the impartiality of judges, or the rule of law. All of that they were prepared, they did assume, and it never arose for discussion as a matter that had to be written down in some form. Colonization itself began with that assumption. I was aware of a case early in our history, after settlement, and I learned yesterday, or maybe, no, I learned yesterday that that case, actually the first Australian civil case that was ever decided, is part of the rule of law's material for school children, and it is this. Less than 6 months after the fleet arrived, on 1 July 1788, the first writ was issued out of the Court of Civil Jurisdiction in New South Wales. And by the way, when Governor Phillip arrived, or Captain Phillip arrived, and then he became Governor Phillip when he arrived, he became Governor Phillip because he he proclaimed the commission that appointed him governor. That's the first document. Now he's the governor, he can do other things. The second document he read was the document that established the Court of Civil Jurisdiction, which says a lot about the sense of significance that this military man placed upon the rule of law. He would not have known that expression, but it was the second document that he read. And within 6 months, a writ was issued out of that court, and the plaintiffs were Henry and Susanna Cable, 2 convicts. And they sued the captain of the vessel that had brought them there for losing their luggage. And they won. That, I think, is an extreme example of everything that I've tried to illuminate tonight, operating upon people. We know instinctively that this is a good way to live. And we can look at some gross statistics. There's a thing called the Transparency International, which annually publishes what they call the Corruption Perception Index, which seeks to identify and quantify the level of corruption pertaining in different countries. And there are 180 countries. We do pretty well. I think we come in at about 14. New Zealand does a little better. Anyway, none of that matters really. A score of 1 is excellent. Nobody has 1. And 100 is terrible. 38 of the top 40 countries have the rule of law. The 2 that don't have the rule of law and are not very corrupt are the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, and they're rich, which I think matters. Russia comes in at 141 out of 180, but you'll remember that the people of Russia have lived under an absolute ruler who rules arbitrarily since it became a state in about 1547 or 48. So what do I get out of it, all of this? I get out of it that wherever people come from, they're all essentially the same. And it can be proven by close, detailed examination of us as humans that that's so, both in terms of our physical makeup and in terms of our behavior. Institutions such as courts and parliaments are groups of people like that who, as members of a group of Australians, who then become members of parliament or who become judges or who become members of police or members of hospital staff, are people who, as members of that group, share a common appreciation of their expected behaviour. They intend to deliver it themselves, and they expect it to be delivered by others. Some of that, as I've tried to show, is inherent in our humanity, and some of it's cultural and ingrained and trained within us by the various forms of learning in which we engage. But the depth of the common assumption that is held means that an institution, or the system, if you're being critical, it's the system. If you're lauding it, then it's the institution. The system or the institution is just the people who are doing things. And if they're doing things for the same purpose, generally in the same way, according to the same assumptions, well, by goodness, it's an institution. And it has a continuing vitality. It'll survive for so long as those assumptions continue to be closely held. A single rotten apple, or 2 or 3, will not destroy it. We're seeing this with the American experience in the last few years. The attack by the mob after the last election was a horrendous thing. It bore similarities to what was happening in Weimar Germany in the 20s. But it wasn't like Weimar Germany, because the United States is not Weimar Germany. The United States, whatever faults appear in the newspapers, has institutions that are peopled by the sorts of people I've been discussing tonight. And so those institutions moved slowly, as institutions do, and inexorably towards identifying the people who rioted on that day, charging them appropriately, bringing them before the courts, and seeing that the consequences follow. And there are other instances of institutions in the United States reacting to the troubles that they've encountered. So we needn't fear too much for the continuing vitality of our institutions. Margaret mentioned my father, and he was born in 1910 in Siberia, in a village near Lake Baikal, which is just across the border from Mongolia. He was a Cossack. The Cossacks were a group of Russians who identified themselves as Cossacks because they asserted their own independence, and they insisted that they be left alone, that nobody interfered with them, subject to this, that when the Tsar called up the army, they would come along. They liked to fight, so it was no trouble to them. But only by that arrangement would they cooperate. Otherwise, there were people who wanted to be left alone. They had their own systems and elected their own leaders. After the revolution, after the Civil War, and after the Bolsheviks won the Civil War, my father, who was about 20, and a group of other young men left Russia on horseback and entered Mongolia. And he was never going to come back. He made his way down through China to Tsingtao in the north, and then finally down to Shanghai, where he got a job. That's Siberian ponies, China, which are a lot like China ponies. They're very, very small, and they raced them in Shanghai and in Hong Kong before the war. And after the war, just by the way, this is apropos of nothing, they began importing Brumbies from Australia to race in Hong Kong. But it's funny seeing some of the photographs, because the jockeys were amateur Englishmen. Later, Chinese and Portuguese became jockeys, but initially they were Englishmen, because English men in the colonies want to ride, so they rode. And you ride at the races on Saturday. And their legs almost touch the ground because the horses are so small. So my dad left that kind of living and got a job in Shanghai. That's him on the left-hand side with the hat. He began working for this man in the coat leading in the winter, a man called Eric Moller, who was a ship owner, you know, as rich as anything, English. That's his son on the horse. Look at it. Look at where its feet are. It's ridiculous. Anyway, he did pretty well. Moller was so rich that he wanted his horses taken to Hong Kong to race in the season there. And that's one of Moller's horses winning the Hong Kong Derby in 1941. Christmas 1941 was when the Japanese took Hong Kong as part of their moves in the Pacific. My father and mother married in Shanghai, and after the war, when the communist side won the Civil War, my parents were taken up by the International Refugee Organization, which was a body of the new United Nations organization at the time, and they were sent with a large group of other Russians who wanted to leave Shanghai at the time to a camp in the Philippines that the Americans had made available to them very generously, with all its equipment, tents and all the stuff that they needed. And so they were in this camp, that's the tents, on a little island called Tubabao at the very bottom of the Philippines. And that's my dad on the right-hand side standing up. My mother's not in the photograph. But yeah, anyway. They waited to go somewhere, and they ended up coming here. That's the application signed by my father on behalf of the family to enter Australia. And you'll see in the middle, it might be too small for you to see, but in the middle section, under the name where it's printed in capital letters, there are 4 items. One of them is full name. The second is nationality. It says stateless Russian. And the third one is race, European. And it says state also, whether Jewish or not. And they came to Brisbane. That's Brisbane in 1950. So they knew, like all refugees know, what they would gain for themselves, and they had a child at that time, my brother had been born. They knew what they would get here, and Margaret has mentioned that what he was seeking, at least the way he put it to me, was order. He wanted order. And he didn't mean order of the kind that Nazi Germany had. He meant order of the kind that we're enjoying and that we're celebrating tonight. He meant the rule of law, although he didn't know the words rule of law, but he knew, as every refugee who comes here knows, it's pretty good here because people get on. And they may not understand they, I'm sure, don't understand what underlies the possibility of all of that and what guarantees it. But they know about the belief because they wish that they could believe in it too and enjoy its common belief among the people here. So it's that same yearning for a cooperative society that leads people to risk their lives and the lives of their children sometimes, stories that make my parents' story nothing by comparison. We come to this point, which is close to the end. I don't believe that there is any imminent risk to our way of life in anything of which I'm conscious here. I don't believe that there are any risks to our way of life in terms of the rule of law from the inclusion of immigrants. There has to be a policy about immigration, but I don't think there's any place in that policy, any need for any place in that policy to be wary of letting people in who have some kind of different human belief in the way that they want to live. I think that the risks that we face are much more subtle. I think that they're internal. I think that they are risks that arise from the activity of people who have particular personalities, no doubt genetic, and their personalities, some of them are narcissists, some of them are zealots. They're all ignorant of the things that we've been thinking about tonight. I think the danger lies in those sorts of people. None of those sorts of people are going to lead a revolution or try to promote a sudden change in the way that our system of government works. What those sorts of people do is to intrude incrementally so that damage is done, and if it's allowed to be done, it may be done so many times that we become habituated to it. We need impartial judges. We need judges who are independent of the executive. What we mean is judges who are independent of politics. So an impartial judge has a duty to apply the law. One of the ramifications of the rule of law is that you can't be condemned unless you've breached a law and been found by an impartial judge to have breached the law. You can't be found to have breached the law unless you've had a fair trial before an impartial judge. We've been centuries in the making of rules and principles that seek to guarantee that you get a fair trial. Some of those rules have, over time, been found to be wrong. And so the rules are changed, sometimes by legislation, sometimes by judges making decisions themselves, largely by legislation these days, because it's the fastest and surest way of doing it. Sometimes that change is right, sometimes it's wrong. But judges don't make those changes. So judges have personal opinions. You don't leave your brain behind when you go to the bench, although it seems that way sometimes, in some cases. But a judge has no right to conduct a trial according to his or her own special ideas of what a fair trial ought to look like in order to achieve some idiosyncratic personal aim. A judge who seeks to conduct a trial that way is incrementally damaging the rule of law. Moreover, a judge who enters the political arena to advocate policy about how trials should be conducted, generally or in specific circumstances, is also engaging in activity that is unbecoming a judge. because a judge must remain impartial and independent. And as soon as you wed yourself publicly to a policy that you advocate, you've become a politician. So that's the kind of danger you have. We not only have a constitution built upon the assumption of the rule of law, we also have a constitutional democracy. You can have the rule of law without having a democracy. You could have a dictatorship that has a rule of law. I find it hard to imagine you can have a constitutional democracy without the rule of law. The one inherently means that you're going to have the other. In Australia, the notion of a constitutional democracy and the notion of the rule of law support each other, although they're different things. The rule of law imposes restrictions upon government action. That's its purpose. It imposes restrictions on us because we have common assumptions that we're going to behave in a particular way. But in essence, it's about restraining the conduct of governments, because people, whether they're in government or not, often want to dominate other people and make them do things. And the rule of law says you can't do it unless you do it this way. Now, in order to ensure that that continues, we have to be able to, in our democracy, to vote for the people that we want to vote for. That means that we have to have the information that we need in order to make a proper judgment about who we should vote for. That's, you know all that. Free speech. High Court decided it in a case called Longy, that you're free to say things even if they're defamatory, if they're said, bona fide in the course of political discussion, because you need political discussion, and political discussion is often harmful to reputations and hurtful. But you need that because that's essential. Now, one of the things that you need to know about as a citizen is what the government's doing. And one of the things that most governments would rather you not know is what the government's doing. So they have laws correctly to ensure that public servants and other agents of government ought not to speak about government affairs. Almost every statute, if you take the Income Tax Assessment Act or the Tax Administration Act, I think would be the relevant one, it will say something like, you must not disclose anything you learn as part of your duty as a public servant except for the purposes of your duty under this statute. And doctors have that, working in hospitals, the health department has it, they all have it. So that's a good thing. There are many things that ought to be kept confidential in government work, but some things ought not. And there are often things that the government would wish to ensure are never known, although they ought to be. So here's the thing. The continued existence of our constitutional democracy depends upon citizens being promptly and accurately informed about the doings of government. Much of that information, perhaps in many cases all of that information, is information that's obtained by journalists and communicated by journalists. Much of the work of government is confidential, as I've said, and even some of that is information that is obtained and communicated by journalists. There ought to be restrictions upon the ability of journalists to get some information, but in other cases there ought not be. And so a government that seeks to restrain journalists' access to information wrongly is by that means encroaching upon constitutional democracy, the operation of the rule of law, because it precludes knowledge that would guide voters in the decisions that they're going to make about the future. It's long been accepted, even by appellate judges, that the media, the press as we used to call it, constitute the fourth pillar after legislature, executive and judiciary for that reason. So my point tonight is that we're all the same where it matters. The respect in which we're all the same, despite cultural differences, means that any threat to the rule of law will not come from interaction between groups and offensive attacks upon our system of governance by some group or some outsiders coming. It will come from wrong-headed narcissists and zealots here who have ideas about what ought to happen that they don't appreciate, conflicts with these essential principles that ought to be eternal. My view is that our institutions, because they actually consist, they have a name, there might be a building, there's a statutory structure to them, and to a degree a physical structure, but they're constituted by people. And those institutions, I would put this forward without much risk of being proved wrong, are almost all unanimously consist of people who hold the same assumptions as we do. But to the extent that they don't, they're strong enough to withstand the assaults that are occasioned by them. The thing to watch are the incremental intrusions into those core practices that reflect our beliefs, not some fear of a large, gross assault by a lot of people or by some outsiders. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for listening so patiently. I'm sure I've been too long.